Alrighty, so you guys have been learning about audience. What are the considerations of audience? What do we think about when it comes to audience? Does the audience even matter? Well, you have seen it from the side of writing, and now I'm going to talk to you about it from the side of analyzing literature. Okay, so these are questions of audience when analyzing literature, things that we need to think about and take into consideration. So the first thing is, did the author have an explicit audience in mind or no? If you end up reading a journal or a diary, or maybe somebody's just self-reflective poetry, there may not be an explicit audience in mind. There is an implicit audience in mind. We always have an implicit audience in mind for whatever we're writing about. The audience might be ourselves, our mothers, our future children. It might be God, but we always have an implicit audience. The thing that we're thinking about is, do we have an explicit audience in mind? Whether that be people of my country or children under the age of 6, or, who is it that we're thinking of? If the author did, who was the intended audience? Okay, some pieces have a very, very explicit audiences in mind, and we'll get to that to go through some actual examples. But who was the audience? Once we think about who the audience was initially, we got to think, what qualities of that initial audience differs from us, especially if it's an older piece. A lot of the classical canon we're going to read is older pieces. How are they different than we are now? How should we adjust our reading to compensate for those differences? An easy example is the way that people speak to each other flirtatiously. Um, if we read something that's dated back to, the 1500s, the way that you court is very different than how you court today. Okay, what was the meaning? So some of it also includes cultural differences, understanding what is the culture. I took this example from the Bible. Ruth 3, verses 7 through 10. It says, after Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, so took off his shoes and socks, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman laying at his feet. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your covering, like your clothing, over me, for you are my family redeemer. The Lord bless you, my daughter, Boaz exclaimed. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone to a younger man, whether rich or poor. Okay, for those of you who don't understand the culture, that seems bizarre. What is happening here? But according to Jewish tradition, Ruth was a widow, and she could marry her closest family relative because she was a widow with no children. She had nobody to look after her. Okay? And so what she's basically doing is she's asking Boaz if he will marry her. Okay? Now, to us, for a woman to ask a man to marry her is a little bit unique in and of itself, but to do so by sneaking in while he's sleeping, taking off his shoes, and laying beside his feet is even more bizarre. Well, what this did during Jewish culture was that it demonstrated that she was submissive to Boaz and that she needed a protector. So this was the way that she was supposed to do this, okay? So again, if you don't have that cultural understanding, ooh, that's a little bit different. But if we're thinking about who was the intended audience of the book of Ruth, there was an intended audience, right? They were keeping record, probably for Jewish ancestors, to know about Ruth and the consideration, right? It was written kind of as a history of the experiences, and Ruth ends up being important because she is one of the ancestors of Jesus. So if we keep that in mind, they want to explain to you what was happening because this was written for Jewish people, a Jewish history. But as an outsider coming in, you need to have that explained to you. Those are the kinds of thoughts we need to have with every single piece of writing. Okay, how do we respond as an audience? Why do we react the way that we do? And how successfully does the author reach his or her audience? How so? If you think about Shakespeare's plays or poetry, for years and years we have said that he was fantastic and that he reached his audience in such great ways. But the question is, how does he do that? And how does what he's saying apply to the time period in which he wrote and also to the time period today? Because it does so in different ways. When you're thinking of audience and you're analyzing a piece of literature, you can always say, did this person meet who they intended to? Why or why not? So let's look at some actual examples. All right, Animal Farm. You guys are used to this one, right? You know this one. Who was George Orwell's audience, right? He was speaking specifically to people in industrialized democratic nations at the time of World War II. He had a very specific audience. He was trying to communicate a message. And we've already talked about the way he wrote a novel instead of writing a newspaper article or writing a report. He wrote this to gain the mass understanding. He wrote to a time period in which many people were literate, many people liked stories. It was a form of popular entertainment, right? Because they didn't really have TV and so forth at the time. So he wanted to get the mass populations of industrialized people to understand his message. Okay, very different then. Think about this. These are two more modern. This is Romeo and Juliet, 2013. This is Romeo and Juliet, 1990 something or other. Think about who their audiences were. Probably younger people. They're trying to update, modernize, right? They were sold big. This one has guns and so forth and gangs. They wear kind of silly, ridiculous 90s outfits, right? Think of this popularity versus this. You can think of this as the movie poster to Romeo and Juliet when Shakespeare actually produced the play. Now, think about it this way. His audience. He had a very specific audience in mind. Many of his audience members were totally illiterate. That's why he wrote plays instead of novels and not instead of books. Okay, most of England was illiterate. Most of his paying public would need something. He had to produce very quickly, so he made his lines rhyme. He had to make them sound very clear, so the rhythmic way, the iambic pentameter, made it easier for the audience to understand what his actors were saying, but also made it easier for the actors to remember their lines quickly. Additionally, he was usually commissioned by the queen or her court, so he needed to make sure that to keep a living, he entertained them and didn't say anything too politically incorrect, that type of thing. A lot of Shakespeare's personal life went into his plays because if he offended the queen, well, that would be quite bad, right? Think of that audience versus the Odyssey, an epic poem, again, because one person had to memorize it. There was one orator, and he had to share it over and over again. So it had to be easy to remember, it had to be entertaining, and it was to an entirely illiterate mass. Okay? Think of that versus House on Mango Street. For a younger generation, very literate, but simplistic writing. To a time period in which the Latina and Hispanic culture is under consideration. Okay, look at these three next pieces. How are they similar and how are they different? Who was Divergent written for? It's short, it's easy, your average high schooler could like it. It's sci-fi, very similar and yet very different to Game of Thrones. Most of you have heard of Game of Thrones. Very long books written for adults, very graphic, but very much for enjoyment, right? Easy to read for an adult, but complicated, educated mass. What about the Lord of the Rings series? Very, very different cases. So consider that as you go through with each of your pieces of reading, right? All of these questions. All right. Good luck.